Well, good afternoon and welcome to the second session in our series, Living for Jesus in a Post-Christian World. Last week we did speak about ethics, and this week's topic is Christian beliefs in a post-Christian world. As I explained at the beginning last week, our post-Christian world is really characterised by a philosophy known as postmodernism. Now, postmodernism is characterised by two interrelated philosophies: relativism, which means that absolute truth does not exist any longer. It's relative now. And pluralism, that all truth is now equally valid. No one person or philosophy can claim a monopoly any longer on the truth. In our first session, we did speak mainly about relativism and how that impacts pretty significantly on ethics and morals. Everyone now gets to decide their own ethics and morals. There are no absolutes. So now a 5'6" white guy can believe he is a 6'5" Chinese woman, and no one feels they have the right to contradict him because that's his truth, and there's no absolute truth against which that needs to be compared. In this afternoon's session, however, we're looking at the corollary of relativism, and that is pluralism, which is the belief that all truth is now completely equally valid. Now, this has particularly disturbing implications for religious beliefs. And in particular, let's be clear about what it is that society is currently saying about religion. Society now says that all religions are equally valid. No one religion can claim that they are the truth and all other religions are not. In other words, there are no absolutes in regard to religion. They are all equally true. Now, one of the disturbing trends that this has led to is a profound philosophical change that I refer to as the growth of secularism. Because there is this view that all religion is equally valid, what's tended to happen is that society has said, well, if it's all equally valid, it's probably just as right to say it's all equally invalid, really. There's no absolute truth. And so secularism is the view that there is no spiritual dimension to life, and therefore that religion is entirely irrelevant. Now, I've got some statistics here. This is some stuff that's been put together from the ABS, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, some of the data that's been collected. And you'll see that there's an orange line on this particular screen, and it indicates the steady growth of no religion on the census. When people are asked to indicate their religious affiliation, there is a very marked increase over recent decades in the people who indicate no religion. I don't have any religious beliefs whatsoever. You'll notice on the screen, in 1971, 6.7% of Australians said they had no religion. Fast forward 45 years to 2016, over 30% of Australians are now saying they don't have any religion. They're affiliating as having no religious views. On the other hand, now that's an extraordinary growth in secularism in just 45 years. On the other side of the spectrum, you'll see the declining blue line, and these are the people who indicate an affiliation with Christianity. You'll see in 1971, 86% of Australians affiliated in some way as being Christian. Now, I'll talk about that in a sec, but you'll see that 45 years later in 2016, that has shrunk to 52%. Now, even those figures, though, are incredibly inflated, as you would imagine. I mean, for example, in 2016, 52% of Australians are not Christians, right? So that figure indicates people who are not adherents of Christianity, but they are aligning themselves. So in other words, there's a lot of people just ticking the Christian box who aren't Christian. A lot of people who are sitting there and they're filling out their census form one night and saying, the husband calls out, "Hey, darling, what religion are we?" And, "Oh, I don't know, your uncle's an Anglican. Why don't you tick Anglican?" "All right, I'll tick Anglican," And so there's a lot of people so these figures are highly inflated. For example, there are 4 million Anglicans in Australia at the moment, but the census data indicates, and the National Church Life Survey indicates, that on any one Sunday, only 5% of Anglicans are actually in church. 5% of people who tick the box Anglican are in church on a Sunday. So clearly these figures are extremely overinflated, aren't they? There are 6 million Catholics in Australia, but in any one Sunday, only 15% of people who claim to be Catholic are actually in Mass on a Sunday. Now, what disturbs me about these trends is that you can see that in the last 5 years, between 2011 and 2016, these two lines are accelerating towards each other. And there's been a real marked acceleration. And if we extrapolate those lines a little bit further, in about 6 to 7 years' time, they will cross over. So the next census data in, what's that going to be, 2021, we'll see those lines extremely close, and then a year or two later they will have crossed. And Christianity, people who adhere to Christianity, even just tick the box, will be very much less than 50%. Secularism is growing. But there's a second profound philosophical change within society, and this is not just that people are discarding their religious beliefs, but they're doing it militantly and aggressively. There is the growth of militant secularism. There is this increasing hostility towards Christian beliefs. Have you noticed this in the media, in social discussions in recent years, just in the last 12 months in particular? It's becoming increasingly militant and aggressive in its denunciation of Christianity in particular. Increasingly, Christians are being openly ridiculed and vilified for their beliefs. This really has only just begun in the last few years. I find myself asking the question, why? What's happened just in these last few years to make Christianity such a target within our society? I can think of 4 reasons. I think firstly, the exclusive claims of Christianity are a nuisance and an irritant to a society that is increasingly secular. Christianity refuses to play ball with this idea that all religions are equally valid, because we stand on Jesus' exclusive claims when he said, "I am the way, the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except by me." You see, there's not much wiggle room in that, is there? In fact, there's none. Jesus claims that he's not just a way, he's the way. He's not just a truth, he's the truth. And to a society that insists that all religions are equally valid and no one religion has the right to say that they're the exclusive truth, this kind of statement by Jesus is particularly offensive. Make no mistake about it, the exclusive claims of Jesus and of Christians today are highly offensive to our pluralistic society. The second reason why I think Christianity is vilified is because of an underlying attitude of resentment. Because most people feel that they have been oppressed by Christianity for centuries, really, not that they've lived that long. But many people in society today, I think, view the church as having oppressed women over the decades, having dictated beliefs and values to society, and there is this feeling of resentment, I think, that they allowed themselves to believe all this religious rubbish for so long. When Christians are now standing up and sprouting forth their beliefs, society tends to say, "Listen, I used to believe that stuff, but I don't any longer, so not anymore. I won't listen to your antiquated beliefs any longer. Shut up, sit down, I won't listen to you anymore." I think that there's that sort of prevalence within society today. Thirdly, I think there is, quite frankly, disgust at the sexual abuse and cover-ups by the church. And honestly, I don't blame them on this score. I feel disgusted at the abuse and cover-ups myself. But I think it is another powerful driver, sadly, in society's growing rejection of religion and spirituality. And finally and fourthly, of course, there is a spiritual warfare going on. The Bible's really clear about this, folks, isn't it? That there is a devil, an evil spiritual being and his evil demons, and they are hell-bent on destroying the kingdom of God and bringing Christianity into disrepute. They're not sitting on the sidelines idly letting this happen. They're very much involved in what's going on in society. I'm convinced that there is a real spiritual warfare element to what we're seeing happening in Western society today. For all these reasons, and perhaps others as well, Christianity is increasingly derided in the public forum, and I'm sure you've noticed that. I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago on Q&A, the ABC program, they had a panel discussing same-sex marriage. Now, this was in the lead-up to the recent plebiscite, and they invited Katie Forst to come on the panel, and she was the Christian representative, right, with the Christian view. Now, Katie was an interesting character. I don't know if you saw this episode. Katie was over from America. She was raised by two lesbian mothers, right? Now, but as she grew into adulthood, she became a Christian. And on the panel, she was really quite intriguing and a very powerful speaker. And she said, look, I really love my two mothers. Right? I was raised by two lesbian mothers. I love them and they love me. However, I am campaigning against same-sex marriage because not only for two reasons, because now that I'm an adult, I look back on my childhood and I see how dysfunctional it was. And I don't believe it's the right environment for children to be raised in. And secondly, I've become a Christian and my Christian beliefs have swayed me in this direction too. So from a practical sociological reason and a theological reason, I'm not in favour of it. Now, on that panel, Q&A did what they always do with Christians. They get one Christian on the panel and then they set everyone else up. It's like feeding the Christian to the lions. Everyone else on the panel is ready to tear into them. And that's exactly what happened on the panel. Whenever anyone else was speaking, everyone else was really polite and they were listening. But every time Katie spoke, she was constantly interjected. They insulted her, ridiculed her, treated her with complete contempt. It was a disgusting display of intolerance. And the whole time, they were accusing her of intolerance when she was being very polite and respectful. The worst offender, of course, was Senator Sam Dastyari. As you can see there, he was terrible. Everyone was just ripping her to shreds except for this man, Brendan O'Neill. And he actually, he let it go on for a while and then he couldn't stand by any longer and he spoke up in defence of Katie and in his objection to the way she was being treated. And we're going to listen to a 2-minute section of him speaking right now.
Well, here's what freaks me out about gay marriage. It presents itself as this kind of liberal, civil rights-y issue, but it has this really ugly, intolerant streak to it. Anyone who opposes gay marriage is demonised, harassed. We've seen people thrown out of their jobs because they criticise gay marriage. We've seen people ejected from polite society. You know, 200 years ago, if you didn't believe in God, you wouldn't have a hope in hell of getting ahead in public life. Today, if you don't believe in gay marriage, you don't have a hope in hell of getting ahead in public life. There's a real ugly element to this. And I think, you know, you really see it with the whole cake shop phenomenon. This whole thing around the Western world where people are going to Christian traditional cake shops and saying to them, hey, you stupid Christians, make this cake for me. And if they don't, they call the police. There are equality cases. Shops have closed down. It's like a 21st century form of religious persecution. It's horrendous. And I think, you know, it's, of course, some people support gay marriage, as we've heard. That's absolutely fine. But what's extraordinary and unacceptable is that they cannot tolerate the existence of people who do not support gay marriage. And I think we sometimes fail to understand how extraordinary that is. And I think the reason Tony Abbott is very defensive on this issue and is erming and ahhing and shifting from the free vote to the not free vote and all this stuff, he clearly has a problem with gay marriage, but he can't articulate it because we live in a climate in which it's not acceptable, as we've just seen in Sam's attack on Katie, calling her hateful and saying she's talking claptrap. It's not acceptable to express this sentiment in public life.
Hang on,
and I think so Tony Abbott is now being described as someone from the Dark Ages for believing what humanity has believed for thousands of years. Within the space of a decade, something that humanity believed for thousands of years has suddenly become a form of bigotry, a form of hate, something you're not allowed to express in public life. That extraordinary shift in intolerance is something I think all liberals, like me, should be worried about. Gay marriage is not a liberal issue. It has a deeply illiberal streak.
There you go. Interesting. Did you hear the audience were applauding at one point? They weren't applauding in agreement with him because Sam Dastyari interjected with something and against what he was saying, and they all applauded. So, but he was speaking up. Now, he's not a Christian, but he's an advocate for free speech, and he was saying, I can't believe what's happening here. Katie is just expressing an opinion based on her sincerely held beliefs, and we are tearing her to shreds. Yet only a decade earlier, that would have been the opinion of all of us here. And now something incredible has happened, and she's not allowed to express that opinion any longer. And it was, I found myself applauding him at that point. What that Q&A episode demonstrated to me was how marginalised the Christian viewpoint has become in our society, and how intolerant society now is of conservative Christian views. And I found myself thinking, as I was listening to Katie getting pummeled and beaten up throughout that whole episode, if she had been a Muslim and she had been saying, I don't believe in same-sex marriage because of the teaching of the Quran, they would not have ridiculed her at all. They would not have dared to ridicule her. They would have treated her respectfully. But because she was expressing the Christian viewpoint, it's like it was open season. You might have also seen this in the news. It was just in the lead up to the same-sex marriage whole plebiscite. And I know there's a lot of crossover between beliefs and ethics here, but I'm dealing now with the intolerance that there is towards Christianity and the lack of tolerance. In Sydney Uni, for a week, they had a yes stall, vote yes for same-sex marriage. And it was set up in the quadrangle at Sydney Uni. And after about a week, some Catholic students decided, you know what, we're going to set up a stall to say it's okay to vote no. And that's what they did. They set up a stall, they had a sign, it's okay to vote no on it. And their mothers baked some food, and they were offering free falafel rolls to the students. And they had handouts just saying it's okay to say no. And so they set this up one morning. This is after the yes vote stall had been going for about a week. The yes vote people saw them setting up the stall and saw them starting to engage in some conversations. They sent the word around, and literally hundreds, if not thousands, of angry protesters surrounded the no stall. They tore up all their placards and signs, tore up all their leaflets. They got the food and threw it all over these Catholic students, and pushed and shoved and kicked and spat on them. And for over, I believe it was several hours, because the no vote people just refused to leave, they were abused and screamed at. And you can see the picture there with the police just making sure there was nothing too violent going on. Now, that was extraordinary to me. Once again, it was this militant secularism saying it's not okay for you to have a Christian viewpoint any longer. It's not okay, and we won't tolerate it anymore. So that's the second profound philosophical change. The third, I think, profound philosophical change is what I would describe as the redefining of tolerance. It's what really Brendan O'Neill was referring to so eloquently in that episode of Q&A. He was really deeply disturbed. We have lost our sense of tolerance because what we've done as a society, we've redefined tolerance to mean if you don't agree with me, you're intolerant. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's not tolerance, that's uniformity. Tolerance is only possible when different viewpoints exist and are catered for and are listened to. But apparently the traditional Christian viewpoint is no longer allowed in public debate. And anyone who dares to propose that viewpoint is treated with contempt. Here's how society, I think, has come to view tolerance, this word tolerance, how it's now being used. I must not express a different viewpoint. If there's a majority view that's held very widely, I can no longer express a different viewpoint. I cannot hold the view that my belief is the absolute truth. That's a very clear message that society has given us. And I must not try to change another person's beliefs. This is actually having some profound impact on chaplains in high schools. Our chaplains and RE teachers are now being told very clearly You can't initiate a religious conversation with a person of another faith. You cannot insist that your views are right and theirs are wrong. You cannot compare your religious views to their views. You can only engage in conversation, religious conversation, with those who seek it out and ask you. So you can respond, but you can't initiate, because that's forcing your views. And so I'm seeing more and more that chaplains are having to walk a very fine line here, because they're not really allowed to be saying, I believe something that's the truth and you need to hear it. So here's the three things that I think I see happening in our pluralistic society. The growth of secularism, the growth of militant secularism, that's increasing hostility towards religion generally and Christianity in particular, and the redefining of tolerance. All right, in our remaining time, I want to suggest a Christian response to pluralism. How do we respond to these disturbing trends within society? I want to suggest three responses. I want to suggest that there are three things that characterise our response as Christians, or should. And these are arguments that I use in response to pluralism when I'm speaking with skeptics. Number one, society needs to practice true tolerance. We need to redefine tolerance back to the way it's meant to be defined. Secondly, all religions cannot be equally valid. And thirdly, there is substantial evidence for the absolute truth of Christianity. So I'm going to look at each of those three briefly now. So the first one, society needs to practice true tolerance. Ladies and gentlemen, here is the definition of tolerance, the proper definition. Tolerance is treating others with dignity and respect, even when I hold a different viewpoint. That's tolerance. Tolerance does not mean giving up my right to hold a different viewpoint. In fact, isn't it true? Isn't this logical? Tolerance assumes that there are different viewpoints. You can't have tolerance if there aren't different viewpoints. And I think it's important that we as Christians speak up for tolerance. When we see people using the word tolerance incorrectly and pointing the finger at people and saying you're intolerant, we need to be able to say, no, I'm actually not being intolerant, I just happen to have a different viewpoint. That's not intolerance, that's discernment on my point of view. So that's the first thing. The second response, is that all religions cannot be equally valid. Now, pluralism says that all religions are equally true, equally valid, and I can't claim that mine is more valid than another's. Now, look, I'm about to give you a 5-minute summary of what I teach over a whole term when I taught studies of religion and Christian studies at school, when we did other religions. So I'm going to give you a very, very brief summary. This took a whole term. If we compare the four major religions, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism and Buddhism, at every major point of doctrine, they are extremely different from each other. They have very different concepts of God, very different concepts of the afterlife, very different concepts of salvation, and you can read the rest. Now, what I do with the students at school, I say, okay, let's take Christianity as the base religion, just for argument's sake. If we compare everything else to Christianity, everything now on the screen that's in red contradicts the teachings of Christianity. Let's take Islam as the base religion. Everything on the screen now in red contradicts the teaching of Islam. Hinduism, if that's the base religion, everything in red contradicts the teaching of Hinduism. And Buddhism, everything in red now contradicts the teaching of Buddhism. There you go, that's a term. You've just done a term right there. Now listen, the message that we get to at the end of a term at school is this: they cannot all be true because they all contradict each other. They just can't. All right, now I'm going to ask for 3 volunteers. Thank you very much. 1, 2, 3. Thank you for volunteering. That's wonderful. Next time I come and speak, you'll probably sit in the back row, I know now. So what I'm going to do for you 3 wonderful folk, you don't have to do anything, you can stay sitting down. I'm going to ask you a quick question, just these 3 lovely people at the front. Now, it's not a hard question. You don't need to understand quadratic equations or astrophysics or anything like that. It's a really, really simple question. So, and I'll give you 5 seconds, and then I'd like you to answer each one individually. Okay? Here's the question: in what suburb of Sydney was I born? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, let's have a go.
I don't know.
You don't know?
I don't know.
You don't know? Okay. I'd like you to guess. In what suburb of Sydney, just have a guess, was I born? I'd like you to have a stab in the dark. Ready?
Person, Hornsby.
Epping. On the right.
I don't know.
Okay, I think we've had about 10, 11, 12. Okay, there are 12 answers there. Okay, all different. Now, ladies and gentlemen, they can't all be right, can they? Logically, there are only 2 possible scenarios now, aren't there? One of them might be right and the other 11 are wrong, or they're all wrong. In this case, they're all wrong. Canterbury, thank you very much. Canterbury. Now, of course, if I'd got my son here and I asked him, he'd be able to tell you. Dad was born in Canterbury. I think he would. Anyway, probably wouldn't. All right. Now, in regard to religions, exactly the same is true. They can't all be right because they all completely contradict each other. Consequently, there are only 2 logical possibilities when it comes to all the world's religions. Either none of them are true, or only one of them is true, but they can't all be true. Make sense? All right, here we come to the crunch point of my talk tonight. What then is the basis for the Christian claim that it is the truth? What is the basis for the Christian claim that it is the truth? Now, I want to suggest to you that there is, in fact, some substantial evidence for the exclusively absolute truth of Christianity. Now, I've got a whole bunch of resources on my website that you can log on to and have a look. It's under that topic, that little tab, Apologetics, which is really defending the Christian faith. You'll see a whole lot of stuff on there. But I'm just going to pick a few things out tonight, and things that I think are particularly relevant. I want to talk about the claims of Christ, the miracles of Christ, and the resurrection of Christ, very briefly. Because this is the basis for my great confidence in the gospel, my confidence in Jesus, and my sure and certain confidence in Christianity as the truth. Let's talk about the claims of Christ just for a few moments. Because Jesus made some very exclusive claims. He said, I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Not only does he claim exclusivity, he also claims divinity. A number of occasions we see this in the Scriptures when he says at one point to the Pharisees, I and the Father are one. At that point, the Pharisees, the leaders of the Jewish nation, took up stones to stone him for blasphemy because they knew that he was claiming to be God. In Revelation, when he appears to John in a vision, he says, I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and behold, I am alive forever and ever. The first and the last is also a phrase used by God the Father of himself too, and he's claiming to be God there. And then, of course, there's that wonderful scene where Thomas, who missed out on seeing Jesus in the upper room after Jesus' resurrection, when the other 11 apostles were there, Thomas finally turned up and Jesus came and appeared to them a second time, and Jesus calls Thomas forward and he says, Thomas, you said you wouldn't believe unless you put your fingers in my hand and your fist in my side. Well, come and put your fingers in my hand and your fist in my side. And what does Thomas do? He falls to his knees in front of Jesus and he says, my Lord and my God. Now at that point, if Jesus wasn't God, Jesus should have said, hang on, Thomas, whoa, you're just getting a bit ahead of yourself there, young man. Whoa, steady on, now I'm just a mere man. Don't, you're getting carried away. But he didn't. What does he say? He says, blessed are you for believing, but blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. He says, well done, you got it right, but you should have got it right the first time. Mm-hmm. So make no mistake about it, Jesus claims to be God. Now, of course, that doesn't make him God, does it? But it's the first piece of evidence. He actually does claim to be God. We have to deal with that claim. because none of the other religious founders made that claim. Muhammad didn't make the claim. Buddha didn't claim to be God. Confucius did not claim to be God. But Jesus did. So what do we do with this claim? How do we respond to it? Well, let's see if there's any evidence. I think there's profound evidence. I think there's overwhelming evidence that Jesus is who he says he is. And that brings me to the miracles of Jesus. The life of Jesus is an extraordinary saga of miracle after miracle. He healed the blind. He messed with chemistry when he multiplied food and turned water into wine. He does some chemistry there that's mind-boggling. He healed quadriplegics instantly. He'd be a great hit at Sydney Hospital or down to the local hospital. Be healed, be healed, be healed. People popping up out of their beds. He raised at least 3 people from the dead, at least. And he calmed 2 violent storms with just the power of his voice. If God physically visited our planet, these are exactly the sorts of miracles, aren't they, that we would expect of God in the flesh. I mean, what else has God got to do to convince us? What's he got to do? Walk on water, for goodness sakes. Oh, hang on. He did. The miracles of Jesus are an extraordinary testament that verifies, that is a strong evidence in support of his claim to be God. Interestingly, folks, it's not just the Bible that mentions the miracles of Jesus. Are you aware of this? A lot of skeptics think it's just some stuff made up in the Bible. But the Jewish Talmud, which was being written in the 1st century, as Jesus was living and walking and doing these things, they were writing one of their sacred texts. In the Jewish Talmud, they mentioned the miracles of Jesus 14 times. Now, the Jews were the enemies of Jesus, and they could not deny his miracles. We refer to this as corroboration by hostile witnesses, and it's a very powerful piece of evidence for the historicity of Jesus' miracles. Very powerful. No other religious founder performed miracles. Muhammad, Buddha, Confucius. They didn't claim to be God, and their lives were certainly not manifest with miraculous signs that supported that claim. But of course, the major reason why I have come to place my faith in Jesus Christ as God the Son is because of his resurrection. And this really is the heart of the matter. More than any other thing, it's the resurrection of Christ that sets Christianity apart from all other religions and which establishes it, I believe, as the truth, the resurrection. No other religious founder rose from the dead. You can still today visit the tomb of Muhammad, the tomb of Confucius, and the tomb of Buddha. They are still in the grave. We don't even know where the tomb of Jesus is. They've got something there that you can pay money to go and see, I think, in Jerusalem. But goodness knows how they've decided that's the tomb of Jesus. It's an empty tomb. There's plenty of them there. They've decided that one's the right one. Let's charge some money and you can come and see it. But Jesus is no longer in the tomb. He rose. There is no body. He simply is not there. No other religious founder rose from the dead. And his resurrection was witnessed not just by 1 or 2, but by hundreds. As I've said on the screen there, the 1st century historian Luke records many eyewitness accounts of the resurrection, including on one occasion a crowd of 500 people who saw Jesus alive after he had risen. Luke's historical record of this was codified and circulated within the lifetime of these witnesses, and there was no attempt to correct or repudiate his record, because no one could repudiate his written record. There were simply too many eyewitnesses who had seen him alive. I want to talk briefly too about the absence of protestation. In my website, I do deal with a whole lot, all 7 of these criteria. There are 7 accepted criteria for assessing the reliability and the historicity of historical events and historical documents. They are the criterion of time gap, the criterion of dissimilarity, the criterion of embarrassment, the criterion of multiple attestation, the criterion of the absence of protestation, the criterion of corroboration by hostile critics, and the criterion of author credibility. I talk about all of those on my website in great detail. The one I want to just discuss very briefly as we near our end tonight is the criterion of absence of protestation. When assessing the reliability of a historical document or a historical event, historians use these criteria, and this one is particularly relevant for assessing the resurrection and the miracles of Jesus. And here's how the argument goes. Skeptics claim that the biblical account of Jesus' miracles and resurrection are mythical embellishments by his followers long after his death. So Jesus dies, he's in the grave, and they want to perpetuate this religion, and so they start embellishing, making stuff up. Put a few miracles here and a few miracles there, and let's raise him from the dead. That'd be good. That's how skeptics view the miracle stories and the resurrection. But here's the thing. Mythical embellishment within the lifetime of eyewitnesses would invariably result in overwhelming protestation and refutation. Famous and very respected historian Dr. Sherman White states that the only way mythological embellishment can successfully occur is when sufficient time has elapsed between the original events and the time of writing of the embellished account. A fair amount of time has to elapse in order to get away with embellishment, in other words. And he says major mythological embellishment requires at least 200 years time gap. He estimates that at least 200 years is necessary. Let me explain how this works. Who's this gentleman here on the screen? Winston Churchill. Great movie that was just out recently. I enjoyed that movie very much. It's been a couple of generations. It's been 73 years since Winston Churchill led Great Britain to victory over Germany. But let's suppose that in 2018, this year, I write a bibliography of Winston Churchill and I accredit him with magical powers. I invent some ridiculous stories about him, that he worked miracles, that he walked on water, that he raised people from the dead, and that he himself rose from the dead. What would be the result of that? Well, I can tell you there would be instant protest, and there would be voluminous factual corrections published in the literary world. If I was to publish such a ridiculous account, there would be instant protestation. Because even today, there are enough eyewitnesses who are alive who can say, no, what I'm writing is absolute nonsense, and there's certainly a swathe of other material that contradicts those claims. And here's the point. In 2,000 years' time, if someone dug up my writing claiming that Winston Churchill worked miracles and rose from the dead, they would also be able to find a swathe of other documents, literary evidence, contradicting that, refuting my claims, and therefore would enable them to place my writing where it belonged, in the bin, as being utter nonsense. Only 73 years has elapsed, and it's still not long enough to mythically embellish the life of Winston Churchill. But when we come to Jesus, it was a lot closer than 73 years. The majority of the New Testament Gospels and letters were written only 25 to 35 years after the events of Jesus' life. And yet there is no refutation. There is, in fact, resounding silence from society, first century society, in response to these claims. No protests, no refutations, apart from a brief and unsuccessful attempt by the Sanhedrin to start a rumour that the disciples had stolen Jesus' body and faked the resurrection. But there is a resounding silence. Because what could they say? There were still thousands of people still alive at the time that the disciples wrote these accounts. People who had witnessed the miracles of Jesus. And hundreds, literally hundreds, who had witnessed his resurrection. I can't overstate to you this afternoon how incredibly significant the absence of protestation is as evidence for the historicity of the resurrection. It's extraordinarily powerful. The complete and utter absence of protestation. His critics were silent because they could not say anything else. They would have been howled down by those who had witnessed these incredible events. Not only that, but the resurrection is in fact corroborated and cited by a couple of other writers at the time. Tacitus and Josephus make aside mentions of the resurrection of Jesus. I've got more details about that on my website. And finally, there is, I think, some pretty extraordinary confirmation by modern scholars. Over the years, modern skeptics, a number of them, have attempted to disprove the resurrection by subjecting the evidence for the resurrection to rigorous historical scrutiny. And in the end, not only have they become convinced of the veracity of the resurrection themselves, but they themselves have become converted in the process. Now, I'll give you a couple of quick examples. Sir William Mitchell Ramsay. Now, Sir William Ramsay was a highly respected archaeologist from Scotland, a scientist, and he was also one of the leading members of the British Skeptic Society, a bunch of atheists in Great Britain. He set out to disprove the resurrection of Jesus. And he was funded in that research by the British Skeptic Society. They funded his research. He was their great hope that Sir William Ramsay was going to dig down archaeologically, dig down historically into the ancient documents, and he was going to prove once and for all that the resurrection did not occur and that the accounts in the Gospels were fallacious, that they were embellishments made up by the Gospel writers. They funded his research, get this, for 15 years. For 15 years, he embarked on research, and his aim was to disprove Christianity, and the Skeptic Society funded him for that time and were waiting with bated breath for his final discrediting of Christianity. At the end of 15 years, you can imagine their horror when he came out and said, not only have I not been able to disprove it, but I've become a Christian myself. That's literally what happened. And he wrote a book about it. The second person was Albert Henry Ross. He was an English journalist and the author who set out to disprove the myth of the resurrection. He was planning on writing a book called Jesus, the Last Phase. It was going to be him closing the book on this whole Christianity business. He was going to disprove it. But the same thing happened. Over a couple of years, he became converted. He became a Christian. And he ended up writing the classic book, Who Moved the Stone, under a pseudonym. Frank Morrison was the name he used. And this book has led many people to Christ as well. And the first chapter of that book is entitled The Book That Refused to Be Written. And he speaks about the book he set out to write and how in the course of that he was converted. And of course the third one, and you might have seen the film The Case for Christ just recently at the cinemas in the last 12 months or so. Lee Strobel. Lee Strobel was a journalist for the Chicago Tribune who set out to disprove Christianity, focusing on the resurrection. You see, what happened was he and his wife were classic sort of hippies, really, and they were skeptics and they were atheists. But his wife got invited to church and began going to church, and she was converted. She was soundly converted. And Lee Strobel felt that he'd lost his wife. I've lost my wife. And he tried to talk her out of this religious nonsense. And she wouldn't be talked out of it. And so he decided he was going to rescue his wife. I'm going to rescue my wife from this religious nonsense. And the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to disprove Christianity to her. And I'm going to use all my skills as a researcher. And so he spent nearly 2 years researching the evidence for the resurrection and the evidence for the life of Jesus. Not only from the confines of his own city, but he flew around the world. He spoke with historians and archaeologists and textual critics all over the world, trying to dig down into the ancient documents. And the scene in the movie is very moving when he finally gets back after one of these excursions, because slowly, bit by bit, every single premise that he had was knocked out from under him until finally he was just left with the evidence, and the evidence was overwhelming. And he came back home one night after one of these trips and he just embraced his wife and he said, "Honey, I give in. I give up. I surrender. It's true." And he gave his life to Christ. And he went on to write the Case for series of books, The Case for Christ, The Case for Faith, The Case for Easter, The Case for the Resurrection. and one or two others. All right, what do we do? How can I wrap up what I've been saying this afternoon? We live in a world which is increasingly hostile to the gospel. No doubt about it. A world which insists that all religions are equally valid, or, in many people's minds, they're all equally invalid. A world which increasingly rejects any notion of God and correspondingly any notion of absolute morality and absolute truth. How are we to respond? I think we need to be clear. We need to be clear about the truth and unashamed about proclaiming it. There is a God. He created our world. He created us to know him and love him. And he set in place unequivocal, absolute standards for human conduct. We, of course, rebelled against those standards. We were cut off from God because of our sin. But God loved us so much that he sent his Son to die on a cross, to be punished for our sins so that we could be forgiven. And God raised Jesus to life again, opening the way back to him for any who will repent and follow him. And Christ now proclaims to the world, I am the way, the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. But you can come now. You can come. The way is open. That is our message to a postmodern world. The story of Jesus is not a myth. It's grounded in history. It's supported by overwhelming evidence. I suspect that as time goes by, however, things will get worse. I suspect that this will be an increasingly unpopular message. I suspect that things will get more difficult, not easier, for Christians and for the church generally. We will be accused of being arrogant. We will be misunderstood. We will be accused of being exclusive, and I guess we are because Jesus is exclusive. We will be accused of being uncompromising and intolerant, which we are not, which I am not. Our beliefs and values may be increasingly ridiculed and vilified. In the light of that, I want to finish tonight by leaving you with two important scriptures to hold on to and to put into practice. Romans 1:16. Paul says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes." Increasingly, Christians are being made to feel ashamed about the gospel, ashamed of its message. But Paul says, don't be. Do not be ashamed. It is the truth, and it is the only way that people can be saved, by hearing this message. And we must not back down from it. We must not feel intimidated. We must not be made to feel that we must sit down and seal our lips. Do not be ashamed of the gospel. The Bible says, doesn't it, the gospel is foolishness to those who are perishing. We shouldn't be surprised, but that must not stop us from proclaiming it. The second scripture I want to leave you with is the one I quoted last week as well. God's words of exhortation and encouragement to the young, newly appointed Joshua, who was to lead the Israelites into the promised land, a land where there was great intimidation facing them, a land where there were giants in the land. The task was overwhelming, and yet God says, don't look at them. Don't look at the forces that oppose you. Remember who is with you. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Remember that he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world. I just point you once again to the website. There's a stack more information and resources if you want to look particularly at those areas of apologetics and ethics. You'll find a whole lot of stuff on that website. If you do want to sign up to the blog, click on that blog thing you'll get to that page and you can pop your email address in, and there's a weekly blog that I send out. There's also that sheet up the back if you do want to just sign up physically with a pen and paper, and I'll do the rest for you. Last thing to say is, I don't know you folk very well. I can't look down there and see those who are Christians and those maybe who are still thinking about it, but I want to say, if there are any here tonight who are thinking, have been on a journey and haven't quite really reached that point of commitment, maybe tonight has convinced you. Maybe this afternoon you feel, you know what, I think it is the truth and it's time I did something about it. It's time I made that commitment. If that is you, I want you to hear the words of John's Gospel, speaking of the promise of Jesus. And it says, to all who receive him, to those who believe in his name, he gives the right to become children of God. You can change your destiny forever by accepting this Messiah, the Lord and Saviour, Jesus Christ, into your life. And don't put that decision off. Talk to someone, talk to Mark, talk to a Christian, and get them to pray with you about that.